Greetings. Welcome to another BankBeat conversation. I'm Tom Bengtson, publisher of BankBeat magazine, and my guest today is Bill Horlitz. Bill is a director at Premier Banks in Maplewood, Minnesota. I think probably a lot of people listening to this podcast know Bill as a longtime regulator, about a dozen years with the state of Minnesota, and then prior to that with the FDIC. So we're going to talk a little bit about general challenges in the industry today, and then we're also going to reflect back on some of those years when Bill was serving the industry as a regulator. Bill, thanks for being here.
Yeah, good to be here, Tom. Good to get reconnected, too, with you.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your work on the board of directors for Premier Banks. I know you're on committees. What's your role there? How did you get there? What are some of the primary things you're working on these days?
Well, when I retired from the Commerce Department in 2013, almost immediately upon announcing my retirement, Don Regan, the founder of Premier Bank, contacted me and wondered if I'd be interested in joining the bank board. What was I going to do? And I had done a lot of work with Don over the years. We pioneered some exam technique, particularly with participation loans, working files at lead banks that were very efficient, and so we had quite a bit of time together. And so it, thinking about it, I'd have been contacted by some others, but it was a good fit. They had then, we had a Rochester charter. I live in Rochester, and so it was a good fit, and I joined the then 3 Premier Bank boards of directors, the Maplewood charter, which is the charter, celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and then the Minnesota charter, which was based in Hastings, and Rochester, which charters came out of buying branches of the former Midwest Federal that failed during the S&L crisis. So that's how that kind of fit together. And since joining the bank, I sit on the Minnesota Charter Loan Committee. I sit on the Asset Liability Management Committee. I sit on the Audit Committee, the Governance Committee, and then do sundry consulting type activities. If we're going to do an acquisition, I'd be on the acquisition team and things like that. So, just kind of an ad hoc kind of guy to do stuff that they would hire somebody to do, but they got me, so they trust me.
There you go. And so joining the board in 2013, so you're in your 11th, 12th year with that project, and a lot, of course, has happened. You mentioned the consolidation of the charters, and then, of course, just a lot has happened in banking with the advent of technology and changing competitive environment. What are some of the things that have stood out in your board service that you think are interesting?
Well, when I joined the bank, it was coming out of the Great Recession. Premier is a real estate lender, a commercial real estate lender, community bank, but heavy in real estate, and we had some struggles during the Great Recession, worked out of them, and since that point in time, it's been a pretty strong growth. The founding charter grew to over $1 billion, and now the 2 former Midwest charters are in the $700 million range. So we're approaching a $2 billion company, which is pretty significant.
Absolutely.
And it's just interesting. I think when we look at the events that were cornerstones of a career, I don't think anything could have been more challenging following the Great Recession than to hit COVID. Mm. I mean, we look at how you're supposed to shock a balance sheet. COVID shocked balance sheets. And all of a sudden, businesses shut down, the economy shuts down, schools shut down, the federal government, we got a problem. They immediately went and did the PPP loans, mm-hmm. which became almost around-the-clock focus for banks in general, but Premier Bank specifically. Our whole team was working very odd hours. So you couldn't get into the website until midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning. And so we serviced, I think the numbers were between the entire organization, about 100 million in PPP loans. Well, and then we got massive influxes of liquidity. There was no place to invest. Deposits, interest rates are at 1%. We got surge deposits. What are you going to do with it? There's no place to invest it. And now you're growing, so your capital is getting strained because you got so many deposits. Banks are almost wanted to charge for deposits.
Yeah.
And well, we come out of COVID and the recovery starts, but federal dollars pumped into the economy. Inflation hits. The Fed goes to tightening. Prime rate goes from 3.5 to 8.5. We've been through that before on a grander scale, but the similarities between the early 80s and now was prime rate doubles. Your cash flows were all based on a prime rate that was 3.5, and now it's 8. You had a 1.2 net cash flow on a commercial project at 3. You might not have that at 8 unless you can adjust rents. You know, so you get that kind of stress. Well, in conjunction with that, liquidity tightens and tightens and tightens. And so now we switch from surge deposits and demand deposits, and now we're back. CDs are the funding source. And you're looking at local market, highly competitive. You're looking at wholesale CDs, you're looking at Federal Home Loan Bank, you're looking at your correspondents to provide the liquidity matches. And then we, fast forward until a year ago, and all of a sudden a high growth fintech bank, Silicon Valley Bank, fails in a week.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the Fed's in there. Nobody's got any liquidity. And where do you react? And the Fed came up with bank term funding, which enabled the banks to pledge their entire loan portfolio, not to take a haircut, which, stabilized liquidity. I think in my 50 years, that was probably the most effective tool that they used, because it got us by a crisis. And we're still, that program expired in March, last month, but you could still renew for a year, so it provided a safety net. Well, you get about the time where this project is getting renewed, and some of the same factors that caused Silicon Valley Bank with Community Bank in New York, all of a sudden, who bailed out one of the failures a year ago, all of a sudden they're looking bad. And so, wow, are we going to visit this again? Well, a number of investors created a rescue for that institution, but so now we're just focused. I mean, liquidity is just affecting everybody.
Right. Well, it has been a crazy ride in the industry, really, since 2020, right, with the onset of the pandemic and, as you mentioned, PPP and just the interest rate changes and everything that's gone on in the last few years. It's just incredible. And as you reflect on your experience of 50 years in the industry, can you ever remember a time that was this dynamic in terms of change and its impact on banks?
Well, the rapidity of the changes. I mean, it's just, with the advent of, Fed Now, 24-hour payments.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, how do you manage 24-hour payments?
Isn't that something? Yes.
And should we?
Well, that's another question.
When you get, we had a meeting yesterday. Do you want to be first in this, or do you want to maybe be second?
Sure. Of course.
It is. Who's going to be the beta of this to find out how this works? And I really look, and I think about it personally, and when we have dialogue at a board meeting. How rapid do we really need to be? Do our kids need to hit every text within a nanosecond of getting that text on their phone? Do we need to, how many of our clients need to be able to wire at 2:30 in the morning, and if it doesn't get by 2:31, we're in trouble? I think that becomes training and understanding, and there's always going to be clients who want immediacy in what they do, and I think we can develop products that meet that need, but I think we need to educate our clients, ourselves, learn what this technology is and how we can implement it. We look at our data service providers. They aren't even up to speed.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure,
sure, we don't have a program for that, and we're dealing with a state-of-the-art company. So, I mean, these are challenges that we talk about at the board meeting. Well, now you have all this immediacy that comes out on due to technology, and the fraudsters are right behind
Sure,
it.
and we're seeing, as you mentioned, fraud, and then of course you mentioned Silicon Valley Bank, where people were literally moving enormous sums of money out of the bank, you know, with a click on their phone, which, like, wow, as a person trying to manage a bank, what do you do with that?
Well, it was interesting because in the fall before Silicon Valley Bank failed, we were talking about fintechs at a board meeting, and I think it was following one of the bank holding company's spring conferences where we had two bank presidents that were computer guys. They weren't even bankers. They're fintechs and they're running the institutions. And so, I mean, that created a lot of interest, and we're talking about that. And the Silicon Valley Bank came up, and so I looked. I said, I kind of heard the name, and so I looked up their call report, and I was just dumbfounded because here was a bank that had 85% of its funding was surge deposits, immediate maturity, non-maturity deposits. And then I looked at the liability side. They had about a 40% loan-to-asset ratio. But the rest of it was long-term securities. 25% of their securities were over 15 years and 35%. I'm going, if that would have happened at any time when I was with the FDIC or the state, there would have been an order on them so fast.
So this was fall of 22 when you looked at this. Yeah, okay,
and
sure.
So when that hit,
yeah.
I mean, and I just made a comment. How are they operating like this?
Yeah.
Because I remember back in the early 80s, the then president of U.S. Bank thought long-term bond rates had peaked at about 9.25, and this was back during the phase out of Reg Q. And he threw 10% of their assets in long-term treasuries. Well, how long are you working for U.S. Bank, or First Bank System, not counting tomorrow, because it had a huge negative impact. And now I'm looking at a bank with total volatile funding, and they got 35% of their.
Sure.
This is just watch the headlines, because we know what's going to happen here.
Sure.
And sure enough, 6 months later, it did, and with pretty significant. I mean, look at what happened.
Right.
What affected the industry at that time? The too big to fail. The Fed's going to bail out all the big banks. What's every other bank in the country going to do if you can't get the liquidity?
And that remains a question, doesn't it?
And it still is a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although we're managing it better, we understand it better, but it doesn't. But all the technology does is increases volatility.
Isn't that something? Yeah, that's a whole new level of risk that bankers need to adapt to, and it's a big challenge. There's no question that I see that from kind of my front row seat watching the industry. Hey, but let's take it back to your time at the state of Minnesota. That was, of course, Y2K had happened, and it's shortly after that you kind of came on. 9/11 happened. Shortly after that you came on, and so there's a lot of things going on in the industry. And actually things seemed like they were pretty strong in 05, 06, in that area. But then, of course, 08, you had the big crash in the fall, and there was a lot to work through immediately after that. And, of course, that affected the environment for banks in Minnesota and around the country. And you kind of have front row seat to all of that. What kinds of things impressed you from that era? And what lessons can we take from that era that might be useful to us today?
Well, I think that when I look back on when I started, my last act at the FDIC was meeting with the de novo bank group out of Owatonna, Minnesota.
Okay.
And my first act as deputy, as assistant commissioner then, was to charter that bank for Minnesota.
Well, there you go.
So we had finished the investigation out of my Rochester office and chartered it in my new job with the Commerce Department. And, you know, you said coming out of Y2K and coming out of 9/11. 9/11 was another shock.
Oh boy.
I mean, you know, look what that did to the travel industry, the hospitality industry, airline industry. I think the seeds, and I've thought about this a lot, I think the seeds for the real estate crisis in 2008 were planted following 9/11 because it was the real estate sector that brought us out of that recessionary time. And like often happens, we think it's too easy, and all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of new bank charters, some started by people in the home mortgage business or mortgage brokers, and dollars were flowing. The Ginnie Mae and Fannie Mae would take anything you bought. Lehman Brothers would package anything they could sell. They had to go to no-doc, low-doc ninja mortgages, we called them, because there was such an insatiable demand for mortgage-backed securities that you couldn't put them together fast enough. Well, I remember we were examining a bank, and a new charter, the bank ultimately failed, Otsego, founded by very nice people, but they were home mortgage people. And we looked at a deal there where a bank janitor owned $500,000 houses that he was going to rent out.
Oh my word!
and you know, it just doesn't work. So our market here was impacted by that kind of lending, not to the extent of Lehman Brothers, but it was impacted.
Okay.
We chartered 19 de novo banks when I was with the Commerce Department.
Okay.
From 2008 to 2013, 21 banks failed, of which 7 were de novos.
I see. 7, yeah, okay, yeah.
So 7 were the de novos, 2 of them were in and out in the mortgage world. So, I mean, it was very challenging. Here we have exciting new investment opportunities. Capital was coming in. We hadn't seen new charters for a number of years, and now we did. I mean, two of the leaders currently from that period of time are Bridgewater Bank and Tradition Bank.
Yes.
Interestingly, executives from former FDIC colleagues.
Yes, right.
I mean,
right.
that's just coincidental,
Sure.
but talented people. But
absolutely.
So you look at what came out of that and you go, it's kind of a wow factor, at least in the community bank world.
Yeah, well, 2 very strong franchises, and it's fun to watch those 2 organizations as they grow. Of course, before you were at the state of Minnesota, you had a long career at the FDIC, and I know you were involved in some of the most challenging situations that the FDIC had to deal with in the 80s and some in the 90s. What about those? Tell us a little bit about your experience there, and again, what you remember and what lessons we might draw from it that would be applicable today.
Well, I think the first one was 1982. A little shopping center bank in Oklahoma City, Penn Square Bank, failed. It was interesting because I was at a resort in Glenwood, Minnesota, Peters Resort, and Peters Resort is where the independent bankers was founded.
Yep.
The National with Ben Du Bois
Yep.
and that group, and we were watching TV, and I went, commented to our friends, I wonder who I know is going to be at Penn Square Bank, and come Monday morning I found out it was going to be me. And so I was assigned to the investigation unit down there to try to probe into what actions took, what can we learn from this? Mm-hmm. The outcome of that resulted in the failure of the 8th largest bank in the United States, Continental Illinois. Loan participations bought from Penn Square Bank caused that bank to fail. They had sold loan syndications all over the United States, Michigan National, Seattle First, others. I mean, just noteworthy leaders in the banking world. And during those first few days down there, the hottest commodity in the state of Texas was trying to find a copy machine. Because of all these oil and gas loans out of Penn Square Bank, nobody had credit files. The only credit file, they were just selling promises to pay. The banks did not have credit files. One bank did 300,000 copies in a 24-hour period and burned out the machine and had to get another one shipped in. I mean, so recklessness. What's similar to that? Any recklessness in Lehman Brothers in 2008?
Sure.
In the mortgage? I mean, so it's very much parallel that if you had an oil and gas loan out of Texas, I don't care whether they're documented, this is gold.
Sure, sure.
And there were 3,000 plus drilling rigs in production. Wall Street Journal tracked drilling rigs. Within 2 years, there was under 1,000. Oil went to $11.
Sure, sure, sure.
And so it just implodes. Another interesting thing out of Penn Square was 60 days before they closed, Pete Merwick issued their audit that it was a sound surviving institution. Well, we know
isn't that something?
That didn't last long for them either.
Sure. Of course, at the same time, particularly more in the upper Midwest and so forth, you had the whole ag crisis evolving, again, due to interest rate shocks and price of ag land and so forth. Was that something that you had?
Well, I was in the FDIC Wilmer, Minnesota office, right in the heart of ag country.
Okay.
And so we were really up to, we were in the midst of it. And then I was transferred to Rochester to manage that FDIC office, and now we took on Northern Iowa.
Okay.
As part of the territory. So we were just full of troubled small community bank ag troubles, and a number of failures, 2 or 3 fraudulent situations that were not ag related, but they involved banks losing their market share, so they reached out. And so we had some of that. I ended up working a couple of significant bank fraud cases, expert witness in fraud trials.
And that continues, of course, to be something that bankers everybody needs to keep an eye on. Human nature doesn't change, it seems like, right? That has nothing to do with what particular year you're in. But well, I really appreciate this conversation, and I appreciate your perspective and some of the really big things that have happened in the industry in the last 45 years. I know that you were up close to, and so I appreciate hearing about that. But why don't we let's close on that 50th anniversary at Premier Bank. Is the organization doing anything to make a celebration of this milestone?
Well, the magic date is August 1st because it is that was the day the charter opened in 1974.
Okay.
And there's going to be a celebration at the head office in Maplewood on Beam Road and White Bear Avenue on August 1st, and it's going to be look on our website. It's going to be a community celebration. We are a community bank, and we're really looking forward to that.
Wonderful.
That opportunity to thank our customers, to celebrate our heritage and our little place in this world.
And Jack Hillstrom, I understand, still serves on your board. Jack, the founding president of
Jack is a 70-year banker.
It's incredible, 70 years. I mean, that's awesome.
We joked at a board meeting not too long ago that he started when he was 16 years old at F&M Bank in Minneapolis, the savings bank. And I quipped with him. I said, I bet I opened my school savings account with him.
That's hilarious. Oh, my word. And I remember those accounts. Of course, we all do. Yeah, no, that's fun. That's tremendous. A lot of history at Premier Bank, and that's really great to hear about that and the success of that organization. So, Bill, thank you very much for being with us on this BankBeat conversation. We appreciate you listening and invite you back for the next time when we have a guest related to the industry. Thank you.